This is Professor Vijay Kumar Mophare, working as an assistant professor in Department of Electronics and Computer Engineering, WIT Solapur. So today we will have the session on Cascading Style Sheet 3, version 3, which comes under the subject or course that we teach at the third year Electronics and Computer Engineering, that is JavaScript programming. Okay. So the syllabus for this entire course, we have this chapter, third chapter or third unit, dedicated for the cascading style sheets. So what do we learn in this chapter? We learn introduction to CSS and its use in styling HTML pages, then CSS selectors, unit of measurements, CSS box model and layout, and CSS properties such as color, font, background, text, etc. And then last we will see CSS frameworks and responsive design. CSS frameworks such as CSS Flexbox and FlexGrid. So today we will limit our session only towards the what is purpose of the CSS, that is introduction to the CSS, and how we can use this CSS for styling the elements from the HTML pages. As you are already aware what are the HTML tags and what are the uses, in the previous sessions we have understood. So in this session we will understand what is the purpose of the CSS. So what is CSS? The CSS actually stands for, CSS is an acronym and it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Okay, so basically, as the name is suggesting, it is used for styling the HTML page or visually controlling the visual presentation or visual appearance of the HTML documents. So CSS is a separate structure from the HTML. It is called as presentation layer. Okay, so any HTML or web application has three layers. One is structural layer, which consists of HTML tags. Then another one is presentation layer, which consists of the CSS style sheets, which are applying the styles of the to the HTML element. And then the third layer is your JavaScript layer, where we actually decide the behavior of the application, web application. Now, since we are in this session only are dealing with the CSS, okay, let us continue and understand how the CSS can be used in the web application. So to use the CSS, basically you have to select the particular HTML element to which you are supposed to apply the style. Okay, every HTML elements which you can have inside the body, including the body tag. Okay, whatever tag you are enclosing or element you are enclosing inside the body tag, including the body tag itself, you can apply the CSS rules, you can say, or CSS properties such as color, font. Okay, so what is the syntax for that? As you can see on the slide, we have given the example. So say we have to provide this selector. Now what is the purpose of the selector? Selector will choose the particular HTML element, right? So you have the HTML element in the HTML page, right, or HTML file. So if you want to style a particular HTML element, you have to select that HTML element, right, such as body, paragraph, okay, maybe anchor, maybe button, maybe input box, right? So you have to select that HTML element and then apply the different properties, CSS properties, and provide the different values to it. And then we say that you are applying a CSS rules to that particular element, and then it will change its look and feel, right? So what is the syntax for providing these selectors? So the entire CSS file will consist of these kind of selectors, and inside the body of the selector you will have different properties and its corresponding values. Okay, so syntax goes like this. It is similar to the function syntax, except that we don't have the round bracket. So you first mention the selector, then opening and closing curly bracket, and within that opening and closing curly bracket we have a property and value pair. Okay, so first we mention the property, then colon, and then the value of that particular property. Now this property can be background color, maybe background image, maybe color, maybe font size, maybe font color, maybe margin, padding, all these different kinds of attributes or properties which will affect the appearance of the HTML element on the browser. Okay, we will have some examples, then you will understand what it is. So the main point here is that how do I select the HTML, because here we are assuming that we are writing the code HTML in the separate file and the CSS code in the separate file, right? Though you can have the CSS code inside the HTML file itself, but we will avoid that way of doing it, because the most large web applications, we expect that the CSS code should be written in the separate file. Okay. Now there are different types of CSS selector. That means there are different ways through which you can select a particular HTML element in the CSS, right? So which are these selectors? Okay, so these selectors there are totally 6 or 7 selectors. Okay, and most of them, there are more actually, but these are the most 90% of the time you will be using these selectors. So the first selector, CSS selector, is element selector. Okay, so element selector will select the element by its name itself. For example, if I want to style a paragraph, then I will select the paragraph element or p tag using the name of the tag, that is p. If I want to style the div element, then I will select the div as a selector. Okay, then comes the ID selector. Okay, then comes the class selector. Okay, so ID selector syntax is different, class selector syntax is different, right? So we will first have this brief idea, what are these selectors, what is the name, and then one by one we will have the example of each of this. Then second one is descendant selector. Okay, next is attribute selector, then pseudo class selector, and universal selector. Okay, so one by one I will give you the example using a online tool called as CodePen. Most of the time, if you are dealing with the web programming and if you are practicing, the CodePen is the best editor or practicing tool that you can have. So I recommend you that you go and use this CodePen tool. It's very easy and very elegant. All the necessary tools are available at free of cost. So let us have one by one example of CSS selector. So I have opened this CodePen, and as you can see, here I have HTML tag I can write, and then I can apply the CSS property, and then I can also write the JavaScript code for manipulating the behavior of these HTML tags. Okay, or I can manipulate the CSS property through the code also. But here we will only deal with the CSS selectors. So let's assume that I have a HTML tag for div. Okay, and within this div I have typed my name, let's assume. Now as div is the element which doesn't have by default the properties. Okay, so by default properties, as you can see, the output is shown over here. Now suppose I want to make the square shape of this div, so I have to select this div. So first kind of selector is element selector. So element selector means the name of the selector itself I will use for selecting this div. So I will directly use the name of the selector, that is div, and then opening and closing curly bracket, I will give the background color property, right? And I will assign certain color, let's say red. And as you can see, the entire div is red. Now suppose I don't want this by default behavior to the div, I want to restrict its height and size. So I will have the height property. Okay, I will say 100 or let's say 200 pixel, right? And then I have width, and I will say I want is 200 pixel. Okay, as you can see, it is a rectangle, so 200 is perhaps more, so I can make it 100. Okay, and see, as in the below output box, you will have a rectangular div. Okay, so this is what is applying the style means. So what I am doing over here, I am selecting a div element from the HTML file. Okay, and how I am selecting? Using the element selector. Element selector is what? Element selector is the name of that particular tag itself or HTML element itself, and then I will apply the CSS property and corresponding value. So here the CSS property is background color, the corresponding value is red, then the CSS property is height, width, and the corresponding value, right? So it's a value property and value pair, and inside this opening and closing curly bracket. But this is important, this is what we are learning. So this is the way I am selecting the div. But what will happen? What is the limitation of this? If I have multiple div, okay, let's say I have another div. Okay, now here what will happen? This div is again, okay, another div, but it will inherit all the property that I have applied, CSS property that I have applied will be automatically applied to this another div also. So I may want this or I may not want this. right? So this is the limitation of the element selector, where the selected element, whatever element you have selected, if it appears multiple times in the HTML document, then that particular style sheet will be applied to all those elements. So this may be advantageous or this may be a limitation, okay, right? So like this is the way you apply the styles to a particular element from the HTML tag. So this is the example of element selector. Now next type of selector, as we have seen, is a class selector or ID selector. So how do I mention the ID? Suppose I want this div to be colored in green, right? So I will assign this a ID. Okay, so I will say ID, okay, equal to name of the ID. Okay, let's say block. Okay, any name you can apply, and then I will go over here, okay, and I will have hash, the name of the ID, that is block, and then I will apply directly the background color. I will apply different background color to this div and say, let's say green. Okay, and as you can see, that particular division or rectangle is applied the green color. Why? Because I have selected that specific element. How do I select that? First I have to define the ID in the HTML file for that particular div element, and in the CSS file I will use the hash and then name of the ID, and then I will accordingly style it using different properties. So this is called as ID selector. Okay, I first define the ID in the HTML file, and then I will use this ID with the help of hash, okay, to style that particular CSS, right? Another most frequently used, okay, is called as class. So instead of ID I can use the term class. Okay, I will keep the same name, but instead of hash, what I have to do in case of class, I have to do dot. Okay, so now this dot will assume that the block is a class. Okay, so I have defined here the class selector, and then I have applied this. Similar, only the syntax difference is that in the ID we use hash and in the class we use the dot, right? So I hope you have understood, okay, the difference between ID selector and class selector. ID selector we use that to define the ID property attribute, and in the class selector we use the class attribute to define the class or ID respectively. And in case of CSS we use hash to indicate the ID, and we use dot to indicate it is a class, and then subsequent things are quite similar. They are all same. They doesn't differ, right? So I hope you have understood these three different ways or different selectors that we can use to style the particular HTML element in the HTML file. So we will stop here, and in the next section we will see the next subsequent element selector with the example. Have a nice day. Goodbye.